Howdy, everyone. It's Bradley Staller, and this is episode 4 of the Best Bell Fantasy Football Podcast. Thanks for tuning in. In episode 3, I applied the concept of percentile adjusted rates to viewing team stacks in best ball leagues. I identified the Vikings, the Cardinals, and the Cowboys as stackable pieces you should target, and the Ravens, Bears, Texans, and Packers as teams mostly to avoid while stacking. Today, I'll be reviewing the historical upside that some of the biggest wide receivers who changed teams this year bring to their new squad. In one of the more shocking trades, the Packers failed to extend Davante Adams and instead traded him to the Las Vegas Raiders for a first and second round pick this past April. Over the last 3 seasons, no wide receiver made your best ball lineups at a higher percentile adjusted rate than Davante Adams, and only Cooper Kupp slotted in as a wide receiver 1 for your best ball lineups at a higher PAR. When he wasn't slotting in as your wide receiver 1, Davante Adams was slotting in as your wide receiver 2 at the second highest rate, only eclipsed by Pittsburgh's Deontay Johnson. Adams may be switching teams, but this situation feels more like the DeAndre Hopkins high target share moving to Arizona in 2020 than Odell Beckham moving from New York to Cleveland. Even with Darren Waller and Hunter Renfrow catching passes from Derek Carr, it'll be hard to keep Adams outside the top 5 of wide receivers going into 2022. I only have Justin Jefferson, Cooper Kupp, and Jamar Chase ranked ahead of Adams at this point. Now, the Mahomes-Hill connection had been something special over the last 3 years. But just like Adams, the Chiefs weren't willing to extend Tyreek Hill into his age 28 season. Over the last 3 years, Tyreek Hill was wide receiver 4 in percentile adjusted rate for slotting in as your wide receiver 1. However, Hill is considered more boom bust than Davante Adams, and for good reason. Because he may hit that wide receiver 1 slot about 28% of weeks. That's pretty good. But the only other wide receiver who had single digit percentile adjusted rates for being a wide receiver 2, wide receiver 3, or flex spot, whose percentile adjusted rate was at least 15% at the wide receiver 1 slot, was DK Metcalf. It wouldn't be surprising to me if Tyreek Hill puts up closer to wide receiver 10 to wide receiver 14 seasons like DK Metcalf has over the last 2 years. Comparing that to Tyreek Hill consistently being in that wide receiver 6 or higher conversation. The Dolphins have legitimate weapons in former first-round pick Jalen Waddle, who himself put up a percentile adjusted rate of 14% of the time, slotting into that wide receiver 1 spot in your best ball lineups. And that was all during his rookie year. We expect an ascension. And also Mike Gesicki, whose percentile adjusted rate of scoring 16.4 fantasy points was only eclipsed by Kelsey, Kittle, Andrews, Gronk, and Waller over the past 3 years. The skeleton key for the Dolphins offense is the elephant in the room, Tua Tagovailoa. Can he take the step forward to unlock these high-octane weapons that the Dolphins have surrounded him with? After the dust settled from day 1 of the 2022 rookie draft, the Tennessee Titans drafted their new wide receiver 1 in Treylon Burks, and the Philadelphia Eagles landed their new alpha wide receiver 1 in A.J. Brown. Over the last 3 seasons, A.J. Brown has the 14th highest percentile adjusted rate for slotting into that wide receiver 1 spot in your best ball lineups, but the 9th highest percentile adjusted rate for slotting into the wide receiver 2 spot. Brown's ability to take house calls gives him the high ceiling fantasy managers salivate over. But it's the low passing volume offense that hurt his floor. He either boomed or busted. Brown's 84th percentile weekly finish has increased every season. And in 2021, he topped out at 27.1 points as his 84th percentile weekly finish. What does this mean in context? That's the wide receiver 5 behind Cooper Kupp, Davante Adams, Tyreek Hill, and Deebo Samuel. Unfortunately for Brown, The landing spot's not a bastion for wide receiver upside. The Eagles finished second in the NFL in rush attempts last season by one rush to Brown's former team, the Tennessee Titans. However, the Titans threw the ball 41 more times than the Eagles in 2021. The Eagles will need to increase their pass volume and efficiency for Jalen Hurts to access the highest ceilings for A.J. Brown. It's asking a lot. I don't see it happening right away. That's why I think Brown should be considered outside the top 10 of wide receivers until further notice. A lot happened in Cleveland this offseason, but let's not forget that the Cleveland Browns not only trade for Deshaun Watson, but also for Amari Cooper. So let's talk about Amari Cooper for just a moment. Cooper's had the 14th highest percentile adjusted rate of making your best ball lineup among wide receivers and 22nd highest percentile adjusted rate of your wide receiver one slot at 11.7%. And that's over the last 3 years. If fantasy managers get clarity on Deshaun Watson and his looming suspension, like we're not sure if he's going to get suspended or not, that news will impact Cooper. If Deshaun Watson is suspended, it's going to be hard to see Jacoby Brissett sustain Amari Cooper week to week as a mid-tier wide receiver too. He's being drafted at wide receiver 18 on Underdog Fantasy and wide receiver 20 on drafters.com. Cooper's perhaps one of the most overvalued wide receivers whose production can be replaced later in drafts with less risk. You can replace him with the likes of Elijah Moore or newly traded for Marquise Brown. And speaking of Marquise Brown, he was also a day one surprise trade piece. The looming suspension of DeAndre Hopkins did play a part in the Cardinals' pursuit of Marquise Brown from the Baltimore Ravens. And for my thoughts on Brown, listen to episode 3, where I talked team stacks fantasy managers should target. Speaking of big-time targets, the Buccaneers made it a point to target free agent Russell Gage this offseason. Gage is still being drafted at wide receiver 51 on Underdog and wide receiver 45 on drafters.com. Gage has made your best ball lineups at a higher percentile adjusted rate over the last 3 seasons than Michael Gallup or Odell Beckham. In fact, Russell Gage made your best ball lineup in 2021 at a higher rate than DJ Moore, Devonta Smith, Terry McLaurin, and Chase Claypool. Russell Gage has the opportunity to increase his ceiling with Chris Godwin coming off an ACL injury. Antonio Brown is no longer on the team. Rob Gronkowski may not return. And there's no trust in the likes of Tyler Johnson or Jalen Darden, even Brashad Perriman. Gage is going to be the guy in this Bucs offense behind Mike Evans. The last wide receiver I'll look at is Christian Kirk, whom the Jacksonville Jaguars aggressively pursued this offseason. Over the last 3 years in Arizona, Kirk only made your wide receiver one slot for best ball about 2.2% of the time. The wide receiver 2 spot, 10.5% of the time. Wide receiver 3 spot, that was his most often hit. Wide receiver 3, 11.8% of the time, and he was a flex play for you about 4% of the time. In short, he's like in the same range of hitting as Tyler Boyd, Darnell Mooney, Robbie Anderson. It's hard to see how Christian Kirk now all of a sudden accesses an untapped ceiling with the move from the Cardinals to the Jaguars. He's an upside fade. Like, I should have added the Jacksonville Jaguars to another team you don't really want a lot of pieces of going into the 2022 season when it comes to team stacking. There's not a lot of upside there. Christian Kirk, Zay Jones, even Evan Ingram doesn't have the upside that you think he does. And so I think that also fades Trevor Lawrence until we see an ascension from Lawrence. We need to see that Trevor Lawrence can improve the players around him at the NFL level. While other wide receivers like Robert Woods, Devontae Parker, Jamison Crowder, Allen Robinson, DJ Chark, and Marquez Valdes-Scantling certainly deserve conversation, I'll save those players for part 2 of this podcast. That'll do it for today's pod. Thanks for tuning in. If you haven't subscribed to the Best Bell Fantasy Podcast, make sure you do wherever you listen to podcasts. And make sure to check out the Best Bell YouTube channel, where I'll be drafting live throughout the offseason. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter at FFSalter. Thanks for listening. I appreciate it. And later this week, join me on Drafters Fantasy, where I'll do another live Drafters Million NFL Best Ball Championship Draft with my old friend, Billy Muzio. In the meantime, good luck in the best ball streets.